Nothing dramatic happened. There was no headline moment, no sudden break, no spike that forced attention. Prices continued to move, trades continued to clear, screens updated the way they always do. To anyone watching casually, the system looked the same as it had the day before and the day before that. The rhythm was familiar, the pace felt intact. There was no reason to stop and ask whether something had changed, but something subtle did change in how the market carried itself. Not in direction, not in volatility, not in outcomes, in responsibility. For a long time, imbalance had somewhere to go. When buyers and sellers did not line up cleanly, the mismatch did not stay visible for very long. It did not linger in the open. It did not demand immediate resolution. It was taken on briefly by balance sheets designed for exactly that purpose. Those balance sheets were not there to express opinion. They were not making a call on where prices should go next, or whether risk was attractive, or whether conditions were improving or deteriorating. Their role was quieter and more mechanical than that. They absorbed disagreement long enough for the system to keep moving forward. When one side wanted immediacy and the other hesitated, the gap was held. When timing did not match, the difference was carried. When demand arrived before supply or supply arrived before demand, the market did not stall. It continued forward because someone in the middle was willing and able to hold a trade. That role didn't require conviction. It required capacity. Capacity to warehouse inventory for short periods. Capacity to smooth mismatch timing. Capacity to let prices settle instead of a search. As long as that capacity was available, markets appeared calm, even when they weren't balanced, even when flows were uneven, even when sentiment disagreed. Pressure didn't disappear, but it was contained. It stayed inside balance sheets built to absorb it, and because it stayed there, it didn't have to express itself through price. Recently, that containment began to thin. Not suddenly, not visibly, not in a way that triggered alarm. The same trade still happened, quotes still appeared, liquidity still seemed present on the surface. But the way those trades were handled changed just enough to matter. Dealers did not vanish. They did not step away. They did not announce a retreat or pull back in a way that would register as stress. They still showed up. They still facilitated. They still made markets. What changed was how long they were willing or able to carry what passed through them. Prices were still quoted, but size became conditional. Levels were still there, but only briefly. The trade would clear, but it would not stay held. Where imbalance used to disappear into inventory, it now reappeared almost immediately somewhere else. Where disagreement used to be absorbed quietly, it now had to move. Nothing broke, nothing froze. The system kept functioning. It just stopped buffering. This is easy to miss because the language we usually use to describe stress does not apply here. There was no panic, no rush for exits, no urgency in the tape. The market was not signaling fear, it was signaling exposure. When balance sheets are willing to absorb, disagreement stays quiet. When they are not, disagreement becomes visible, not because it is larger, but because it no longer has anywhere to rest. What you begin to see instead is motion without settlement. Prices move through levels instead of pausing at them. Trades connect counterparties directly instead of disappearing into inventory. Size is rationed rather than warehoused. The system still clears, but it clears by passing imbalance along instead of holding it. This is not volatility. It is a redistribution of responsibility. For a long time, the market relied on the assumption that intermediaries could expand just enough to smooth over timing mismatches. That assumption doesn't fail loudly, it expires quietly when balance sheets reach limits that don't negotiate. Those limits aren't emotional, they aren't reactive. They aren't judgments about risk or value or confidence. They're structural. Balance sheets don't stretch indefinitely, they fill. And when they do, behavior changes automatically. Not because someone decides to step away, not because sentiment shifts, but because there is no room left to step forward. That's the moment when intermediation stops being elastic, when holding becomes temporary, when imbalance stops disappearing and starts traveling. The system doesn't announce this change. It doesn't warn you that it's happening. It doesn't attach meaning to it. It simply adjusts, quietly, in the only way it can, once capacity is no longer available. Everything still works, just with less being carried. Nothing about this shift announces itself as a turning point. There is no moment where the system pauses and acknowledges that something has changed. From the outside, activity continues. Markets open, trades print, prices update, participation remains. If you're looking for disruption, you won't find it here. What changes instead is the way imbalance is handled once it appears. When capacity is available, imbalance can be paused. It can be carried quietly, out of view, long enough for opposing flows to arrive. Time becomes flexible. Resolution can wait. The system doesn't rush disagreement toward price because it doesn't have to. When capacity is no longer available, that flexibility disappears. Not dramatically, not violently, just mechanically. At that point, imbalance doesn't stop occurring. It simply loses its place to rest. Without somewhere to be held, it has to keep moving. And the only place it can move is forward, into the market itself. This is where behavior changes without intention. Dealers still facilitate connections. They still match buyers and sellers. But they stop standing between them for long. They stop carrying the result of that connection beyond the moment it clears. Intermediation becomes narrower, shorter, more precise. From the outside, this doesn't look like withdrawal. It looks like efficiency. Trades clear quickly. Inventory turns over fast. Exposure doesn't linger. Everything appears orderly. But order here comes from transmission, not absorption. When absorption dominates, disagreement stays muted. When transmission dominates, disagreement has to express itself. Not emotionally, not urgently, but directly. Price has to do more of the work that balance sheets used to do quietly. This is why markets can remain calm while becoming more exposed at the same time. Calmness is not evidence that nothing has changed. It is evidence that the system is still clearing under new constraints. Participants used to a buffered environment often sense this shift before they can articulate it. Trades that once felt effortless now require more attention. Size that once moved cleanly now needs to be broken up. Timing that once felt forgiving becomes more exacting. There is no rule change, no announcement, no signal to react, just less tolerance for delay. When no one is willing or able to hold inventory, timing mismatches matter more. Buyers and sellers have to meet more precisely. If they do not, price has to move until they do. Not because fundamentals changed, but because capacity is no longer available to bridge the gap. This is the first forced behavior in the system. It is not forced by fear. It is not forced by stress. It is not forced by an external shock. It is forced by limits. Balance sheets reach points where adding more exposure is no longer optional. Not because risk suddenly looks unacceptable, but because the structure no longer allows expansion. Once those limits are reached, behavior adjusts automatically. That adjustment does not require coordination. It does not require agreement. It does not require anyone to decide that conditions have changed. It happens because the old behavior is no longer possible. Intermediation becomes selective. Inventory becomes temporary. Holding becomes brief. The system still functions, but it functions differently. This is where it is easy to misinterpret what is happening. Without volatility, without headlines, without visible strain, the change can look like nothing at all. Prices still move. Liquidity still appears. Participation still exists. On the surface, everything looks intact. Structurally, it is not the same. A system that absorbs imbalance behaves differently from one that transmits it. In an absorptive system, disagreement is dampened. In a transmissive system, disagreement has to resolve itself through price. Neither state is inherently unstable, but they carry different implications for how the market responds to pressure. What matters here is not what comes next, but what has already stopped happening. For a long time, the market relied on intermediaries to make time elastic, to allow one side to act before the other was ready, to let flows pass through without immediate resolution. That elasticity reduced the need for prices to move aggressively in response to small mismatches. As that elasticity thins, the system leans more heavily on price to do the work. This does not require stress. It does not require urgency. It does not require awareness. It is simply how a system behaves when capacity is constrained. Limits don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves through repetition, through patterns that feel slightly different than before, through moments where things still work, but not quite the way they used to. Trades clear, but don't rest. Prices move, but don't settle. Liquidity exists, but doesn't linger. These are not signals of failure. They are signals of exposure. Exposure doesn't mean weakness. It means fewer layers between imbalance and resolution. It means less insulation. It means that disagreement has to show itself instead of being carried quietly elsewhere. At this stage, nothing demands a response. There is no requirement to act, no need to interpret, no reason to escalate. This is not a warning. It is not a forecast. It is not a claim about direction. It is an observation about how responsibility has shifted. The system is still clearing. Participants are still participating. Markets are still functioning, but they are doing so with less being held internally. That difference doesn't predict an outcome. It doesn't imply a timeline. It doesn't tell you what happens next. It simply defines the condition the system is now operating under. Nothing about this condition requires interpretation to exist. It does not need to be recognized to be real. It does not depend on belief or narrative or consensus. It simply operates in the background as a consequence of limits that have already been reached. The system is still functioning. That matters. It is still clearing trades. It is still matching buyers and sellers. It is still producing prices. There is no visible failure to point to, no obvious malfunction to diagnose. What has changed is how much strain the system can absorb without passing it along. For a long time, disagreement could be carried quietly. When one side wanted to act faster than the other, time absorbed the difference. When flows arrived unevenly, balance sheets smoothed the mismatch. Pressure did not disappear, but it was held long enough to prevent it from expressing itself. That holding function is now thinner, not absent, not broken, just constrained. When capacity is constrained, responsibility shifts. The system does not stop working. It simply stops internalizing as much of the work it used to do on behalf of participants. This is why it is important to be precise about what this is not. This is not a moment of stress. It is not a warning signal. It is not an inflection point that demands response. Nothing here requires action. Nothing here requires anticipation. Nothing here requires interpretation beyond noticing that something that used to happen routinely is happening less often. The system hasn't lost liquidity. It hasn't lost participation. It hasn't lost order. It has lost tolerance. Tolerance for delay. Tolerance for imbalance. Tolerance for carrying unresolved disagreement. When tolerance is high, small mismatches don't matter. They are absorbed. When tolerance is lower, those same mismatches have to resolve themselves more directly. That resolution does not need to be violent. It does not need to be sudden. It does not need to be dramatic. It simply needs to occur. Price is the mechanism through which that resolution happens when no one else is willing or able to hold it. This is why calm prices can coexist with fragility without contradiction. Fragility here does not mean instability. It means exposure. It means fewer buffers between imbalance and outcome. Exposure does not announce itself as danger. It announces itself as immediacy. Things that once took time now happen faster. Things that once paused now move through. Things that once rested now keep going. Again, not urgently, not emotionally, just directly. This is the environment the system is operating in now. It is tempting to frame this kind of shift as a precursor to something else, to ask what it leads to, or where it ends, or what it implies. But doing so skips over the most important part, which is the condition itself. Conditions do not predict outcomes, they constrain them. When balance sheets were expanding, a wide range of outcomes was possible because the system had flexibility. It could absorb shocks, smooth flows, delay resolution. As that flexibility narrows, the range of possible behaviors narrows with it, not toward a specific result, but toward immediacy. This is why nothing about this moment demands urgency. The system is not under threat. It is not failing. It is not even unstable in the conventional sense. It is simply operating closer to its constraints. Operating closer to constraint does not mean collapse is imminent. It means there is less margin for the system to behave as if timing does not matter. Timing matters more now, not because participants are more nervous, not because sentiment has shifted, but because there is less internal capacity to absorb misalignment. That change does not show up cleanly in charts. It does not announce itself through volatility. It does not create a headline, it shows up in repetition, in the way trades clear quickly instead of lingering, in the way size is managed more carefully, in the way price moves through levels instead of resting at them. None of this requires interpretation. It requires attention to what has stopped happening. For a long time, the market carried disagreement quietly. Now disagreement has to keep moving. For a long time, balance sheets acted as shock absorbers. Now they act more like conduits. For a long time, time itself was a buffer. Now, time is less forgiving. This is not a moral shift. It is not a strategic shift. It is not a collective decision. It is a mechanical adjustment to limits that are no longer flexible. The system has not changed its goals. It has not changed its direction. It has not changed its structure in any visible way. It has changed how much slack it has. Slack is what allows systems to feel resilient. It creates the impression that nothing is urgent, that nothing needs to resolve immediately, that imbalances can be carried without consequence. When slack is abundant, systems feel calm even under pressure. When slack is thinner, systems can still feel calm, but they feel different to those inside them. Movements are cleaner, resolution is quicker, there is less room for hesitation. This is why the change can be sensed without being named. Participants do not need to understand balance sheets or constraints to feel the difference. They experience it as a subtle tightening of timing, a slight reduction in tolerance, a sense that trades need to be more precise. Again, nothing about this demands reaction. There is no call to act embedded in this observation. There is no implication that something must follow. The system is simply doing less work on behalf of participants than it used to. That is the entire point. Not that something is about to happen, but that something has already stopped happening. The market still clears. It just clears without caring as much. Prices still move. They just do more of the work. Liquidity still exists. It just does not linger. This is not a cliff. It is not a break. It is not a turning point. It is a thinning. And thinning does not announce itself. It does not arrive all at once. It does not demand recognition. It simply becomes the environment in which everything else takes place. Nothing about this tells you what happens next. It tells you how the system is operating now, with less being held, with less being absorbed, with more being passed along. That is not an outcome. It is a condition, and conditions do not need to be dramatic to matter.